The year was 1892, and Ellis Island had just opened its doors as America's gateway to the Promised Land. But behind the Statue of Liberty's welcoming beacon lay a darkness that would consume 41 Irish families in flames of hatred, fear, and systematic murder disguised as public health policy. This isn't the inspiring story of Ellis Island they show you in documentaries. This isn't about huddled masses yearning to breathe free. This is about what happened when fear of disease became an excuse for genocide, when quarantine became execution, and when the American dream became a nightmare from which 164 Irish immigrants would never wake. What you're about to discover has been buried for over 130 years, hidden beneath layers of sanitized immigration history and the carefully constructed mythology of American compassion, because the truth is far more horrifying than any anti-immigrant propaganda ever imagined. Ellis Island's first year of operation wasn't just about processing immigrants, it was about eliminating the ones deemed undesirable by any means necessary. If you think you know the real story of Ellis Island and American immigration, prepare to have everything you believed destroyed. Subscribe now, because what I'm about to reveal will change forever how you see America's most sacred symbol of hope and opportunity. The island of Fyron, January 1892. Ellis Island Immigration Station officially opened with great fanfare and promises of humane, efficient processing of the millions of immigrants seeking new lives in America. The facility was designed to handle 5,000 people per day, with modern medical screening procedures and supposedly enlightened policies for dealing with sick or potentially dangerous arrivals. But what the public didn't know was that Ellis Island had been designed with a secondary purpose: to serve as a testing ground for radical new approaches to immigration control that would eliminate undesirable populations before they could contaminate American society. The man responsible for implementing these policies was Dr. Marcus Whitman, the station's chief medical officer. Whitman wasn't just any government doctor, he was a former Confederate Army surgeon who had spent the post-Civil War years developing theories about racial hygiene and public health that would have made the most extreme eugenicists proud. Whitman believed that certain immigrant populations, particularly the Irish, carried diseases and genetic defects that posed an existential threat to American civilization. In his private correspondence, discovered decades later, he wrote, "The Irish pestilence that has already infected our cities must be stopped at its source." Ellis Island provides us with the perfect opportunity to cleanse America of this Celtic contamination. Working under the cover of legitimate medical screening, Whitman had assembled a team of like-minded doctors, guards, and administrators who shared his vision of using Ellis Island as a filter to eliminate inferior immigrants while maintaining the appearance of following established immigration procedures. The first group targeted for elimination would be the 41 Irish families who arrived on the steamship Hibernia on March 15, 1892. The arrival of the duo Meditha families aboard the Hibernia represented everything that Dr. Whitman despised about Irish immigration to America. They were poor, Catholic, and fleeing the ongoing effects of British oppression in Ireland. Most were farmers and laborers who had sold everything they owned to purchase passage to the Promised Land. Among them were the O'Briens, from County Kirkpatrick and Mary, with their 5 children, ranging in age from 3 to 17. There were the McCarthys from Dublin, the Kellys from Belfast, the Murphys from Galway. 41 families, 164 people in total, who had survived the brutal ocean crossing, only to find that their real ordeal was just beginning. The first sign of trouble came during the initial medical screening. Under normal procedures, immigrants with signs of illness would be temporarily detained for observation and treatment before being either admitted to the United States or returned to their country of origin. But Whitman had other plans for the Irish families. From the Hibernia, using fabricated medical reports, Whitman declared that multiple members of the Irish group were showing symptoms of cholera diagnosis that would justify immediate quarantine and, if necessary, extreme measures to prevent the spread of disease. But there was no cholera outbreak among the Irish immigrants. The diagnosis was completely fraudulent, designed to provide legal cover for what Whitman really intended: the systematic murder of every Irish immigrant who had arrived on the Hibernia. The quarantined DCIPTON, the 41 Irish families were immediately separated from other immigrants and taken to a supposedly secure quarantine facility on the southern end of Ellis Island. The building, known as Barracks 7, had been hastily constructed for this specific purpose and was designed not for medical treatment, but for mass execution. Barracks 7 was a wooden structure approximately 200 feet long and 50 feet wide, with no windows and only 2 exits, both of which could be easily secured from the outside. The building was surrounded by a high fence topped with barbed wire, ostensibly to prevent the spread of disease, but actually to prevent escape. Inside the barracks, the Irish families found conditions that were deliberately designed to create maximum suffering and fear. There were no beds, no medical supplies, no adequate food or water. The building was overcrowded, unsanitary, and completely isolated from the rest of the Ellis Island facility. Dr. Whitman visited the barracks daily, not to provide medical care, but to observe the psychological breakdown of his victims and to refine his plans for their elimination. He took detailed notes on their physical and mental deterioration, treating the Irish families like laboratory animals in a twisted experiment designed to test the most efficient methods of mass murder. The families themselves had no idea what was really happening to them. They believed they were being held for legitimate medical reasons and that they would eventually be released to continue their journey to America. Parents tried to comfort their children, couples held each other for warmth and reassurance, and the entire group maintained hope that their nightmare would soon end. They didn't know that Dr. Whitman had already decided that none of them would leave Ellis Island alive. The conspiracy. Dr. Whitman's plans for mass murder required the cooperation of multiple people within the Ellis Island administration, and he had spent months before the Hibernia's arrival recruiting allies to his cause. The key conspirators included Captain Thomas Morrison, head of Ellis Island Security, who controlled access to the quarantine facilities and could ensure that no unauthorized personnel witnessed what was happening in Barracks 7. There was Dr. Sarah Fletcher, Whitman's assistant medical officer, who helped create fraudulent medical records and death certificates that would cover up the planned murders. Most crucially, there was Heinrich Muller, the station's maintenance supervisor, who had expertise in handling dangerous chemicals and combustible materials that would be essential to Whitman's execution plan. Together, these conspirators developed what they called the Sanitation Protocol, a euphemism for the systematic murder of quarantined immigrants who were deemed too dangerous or undesirable to be allowed into American society. The protocol involved 3 phases. First, the isolation and psychological breakdown of the target population. Second, the fabrication of medical emergencies that would justify extreme measures. And third, the elimination of the targets in a way that could be explained as an unfortunate accident resulting from disease-controlled procedures. This is where the story transforms from immigration drama to horror story, where public health becomes mass murder and Ellis Island becomes a death camp. If you're not already subscribed, hit that button now, because what comes next will show you the true depths of evil that can hide behind symbols of hope and freedom. The final SOLUTO. By April 1892, the Irish families had been imprisoned in Barracks 7 for nearly 3 weeks. Their physical and mental condition had deteriorated dramatically due to deliberate starvation, overcrowding, and psychological torture disguised as medical observation. Several of the elderly immigrants had already died from the harsh conditions, providing Whitman with opportunities to test his cover stories and refine his documentation procedures. The deaths were officially attributed to cholera complications, and the bodies were immediately cremated to prevent the spread of disease. But these individual deaths were just preparation for the mass murder that Whitman was planning for the night of April 12, 1892. Working with Heinrich Muller, Whitman had developed a plan to eliminate all remaining survivors in a single operation that could be explained as a tragic accident, using kerosene and other flammable materials that were routinely stored on Ellis Island for maintenance purposes. They would set fire to Barracks 7 while the Irish families slept. The fire would be designed to spread quickly and completely, ensuring that no one inside could escape. The exits would be secured from the outside, and the surrounding area would be cleared of any personnel who might attempt rescue operations. The official story would be that a kerosene lamp had been accidentally knocked over during the night, causing a fire that spread too quickly for effective rescue efforts. The tragic loss of life would be blamed on the hazardous conditions created by the cholera outbreak, and the entire incident would serve as justification for even more extreme quarantine procedures in the future. The night of fire at 2:30 a.m. on April 13, 1892, Heinrich Muller began his final preparations for the mass murder of the Irish families in Barracks 7. Working under cover of darkness, Muller doused the exterior walls of the wooden building with kerosene, paying particular attention to the areas around the 2 exits. He placed additional accelerants inside the building's ventilation system, ensuring that the fire would spread rapidly throughout the enclosed space. Meanwhile, Captain Morrison positioned his security guards around the perimeter of the quarantine area with orders to prevent any unauthorized access to the burning building. The guards were told that they were protecting other immigrants from exposure to a cholera outbreak that had turned violent, requiring extreme containment measures. Dr. Whitman observed the preparations from his office window, taking notes for his private research while preparing the fraudulent medical reports that would explain the deaths as disease-related casualties rather than murder victims. At exactly 3 a.m., Mueller ignited the kerosene-soaked building from multiple points simultaneously. The fire spread with terrifying speed through the wooden structure. Within minutes, the entire building was engulfed in flames that could be seen from Manhattan. The screams of the trapped families echoed across Ellis Island, creating a sound that witnesses would never forget. Inside Barracks 7, 164 Irish immigrants, women and children died in agony as they were burned alive or overcome by smoke. The exits had been deliberately secured from the outside, making escape impossible. Parents held their children as they died, couples embraced as the flames consumed them, and the entire community that had dreamed of a new life in America perished, together in what had become their crematorium. The fire burned for nearly 2 hours before it finally consumed all the combustible material and died down to smoldering embers. When it was over, nothing remained of Barracks 7 except charred timber and the carbonized remains of 41 Irish families who had committed no crime other than seeking a better life. The immediate cover-up response to the Barracks 7 fire revealed the full extent of the conspiracy that had made the mass murder possible. Within hours of the fire's conclusion, Dr. Whitman released an official statement attributing the tragedy to an unfortunate accident caused by unsafe conditions created by the ongoing cholera outbreak. According to his fabricated account, a quarantined patient had knocked over a medical lamp during a delirium episode, causing the fire to spread rapidly through the contaminated building. The death toll was officially listed as approximately 160 individuals who had been under medical observation for suspected cholera infection. No names were provided, no individual identities were recorded, and no efforts were made to contact the victims' relatives in Ireland or elsewhere. The remains of the victims were immediately cremated en masse, officially to prevent the spread of disease but actually to eliminate any physical evidence that might contradict the official story. The ashes were dumped into New York Harbor without ceremony or documentation. Most cynically, Whitman used the tragedy to justify even more extreme immigration policies. In his report to federal authorities, he argued that the fire demonstrated the dangers of allowing potentially diseased immigrants to enter the country and recommended expanded quarantine facilities and more aggressive screening procedures. The federal government's response was exactly what Whitman had hoped for. Instead of investigating the suspicious circumstances of the fire, they praised Ellis Island's staff for their heroic efforts to contain a dangerous disease outbreak and authorized increased funding for expanded quarantine operations. The WHISTLably low WR the truth about the Barracks 7 murders might never have emerged if not for the conscience of Margaret O'Sullivan, an Irish-American nurse who had been working at Ellis Island's medical facility. O'Sullivan had not been directly involved in the conspiracy, but she had noticed several suspicious circumstances in the days leading up to the fire that made her question the official story. First, she had observed that the Irish families in quarantine showed no actual symptoms of cholera or any other serious disease. Despite official claims of a dangerous outbreak, the quarantined immigrants appeared to be suffering primarily from malnutrition and stress, rather than infectious illness. Second, she had noticed unusual activities around Barracks 7 in the hours before the fire, including the movement of flammable materials and the positioning of security guards in a way that seemed designed to isolate the building rather than protect it. Most disturbing of all, O'Sullivan had overheard conversations between Dr. Whitman and his conspirators that suggested the fire had been deliberately planned rather than accidentally caused. But O'Sullivan faced the same problem that confronted anyone who tried to expose government crimes: how to reveal the truth without being silenced or eliminated by the same people who had committed the murders. The investigation, BGI and Margaret O'Sullivan's solution was to work with sympathetic journalists and civil rights activists outside the government structure who might be able to investigate and publicize the truth about the Barracks 7 murders. Working with Patrick Flanagan, an Irish-American newspaper editor in New York City, O'Sullivan began systematically documenting evidence of the conspiracy that had led to the mass murder of the Irish families. Their investigation revealed a pattern of suspicious deaths and disappearances at Ellis Island that suggested the Barracks 7 fire was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader program of eliminating undesirable immigrants. They discovered that Dr. Whitman had been conducting unauthorized medical experiments on quarantined immigrants, using them as test subjects for dangerous treatments and procedures that had resulted in numerous deaths. They found evidence that the Ellis Island administration had been systematically falsifying medical records, death certificates, and immigration documents to cover up crimes against immigrants who lacked the political power to seek justice. Most significantly, they obtained testimony from Heinrich Müller, who had begun drinking heavily after the Barracks 7 fire and eventually confessed his role in the mass murder to a bartender who reported the conversation to Flanagan's newspaper. We're at the turning point now, the moment when truth confronts power and ordinary people decide whether to risk everything for justice. If this story is gripping you the way it should be, subscribe and comment below. Because what happens next shows the real cost of speaking. Truth to Power in America, The Exposition, September 15, 1892. Patrick Flanagan's newspaper, The Irish American, published a devastating exposé titled Ellis Island's Chamber of Horrors: The Deliberate Murder of Irish Families. The article provided detailed evidence of the conspiracy that had led to the Barracks 7 fire, including testimony from Margaret O'Sullivan, Heinrich Müller's confession, and documentary evidence of fraudulent medical records and death certificates. The story included the names and backgrounds of the 41 Irish families who had been murdered, information that O'Sullivan had painstakingly reconstructed from immigration records and witness testimony. For the first time, the victims were presented as individual human beings, rather than anonymous statistics in a disease outbreak. The public reaction was immediate and explosive. Irish American communities across the country organized protests and vigils demanding justice for the murdered families. Other immigrant groups, recognizing that they could be next, joined the calls for investigation and accountability. The story was picked up by newspapers across the country and internationally, creating a scandal that threatened to destroy the reputation of Ellis Island and the entire American immigration system. But the government's response revealed the full extent of its commitment to suppressing the truth about the murders. The airy tale of Etion within 6 above hours of the exposé's publication, the federal government launched a coordinated campaign to discredit the story and silence its sources. The Irish American offices were raided by federal agents, who seized printing equipment and arrested Patrick Flanagan on charges of publishing seditious materials harmful to national security. Flanagan was held incommunicado in federal custody, where he could not respond to government attacks on his credibility or continue his investigation. Margaret O'Sullivan was dismissed from her position at Ellis Island and blacklisted from employment at any federal facility. When she attempted to continue speaking out about the murders, she received death threats and was warned that her family would be targeted if she didn't cease her activities. Heinrich Müller, whose confession had provided crucial evidence of the conspiracy, was found dead in the East River just 1 week after the exposé's publication. His death was officially ruled a suicide, but the circumstances strongly suggested murder. Most systematically, the government launched a comprehensive disinformation campaign designed to convince the public that the entire story had been fabricated by anti-American agitators seeking to damage Ellis Island's reputation. The official DNA of the federal government's official response to the Barracks Expose was coordinated by the Immigration Bureau and involved multiple levels of denial and misdirection. First, officials claimed that no fire had ever occurred at Ellis Island, despite the fact that the blaze had been visible from Manhattan and reported in multiple newspapers at the time. When this obvious lie proved unsustainable, they shifted to claiming that while a fire had occurred, it had been a minor incident affecting only a small storage building, with no loss of life. Finally, when confronted with overwhelming evidence of the deaths, they returned to the original cover story. The fire had been an unfortunate accident caused by unsanitary conditions during a legitimate cholera outbreak, and all proper procedures had been followed. The government's position was supported by a carefully orchestrated campaign involving sympathetic journalists, paid experts, and political officials who vouched for Ellis Island's integrity and dismissed the murder allegations as anti-American propaganda spread by foreign agitators. Dr. Whitman himself was presented as a heroic public health official who had risked his life to contain a dangerous disease outbreak and prevent the spread of cholera to the American mainland. The long cover-up success of the government's disinformation campaign ensured that the truth about the Barracks 7 murders would remain buried for decades. Patrick Flanagan died in federal custody before he could be brought to trial, officially from pneumonia, but under circumstances that suggested he had been murdered to prevent him from continuing his investigation. Margaret O'Sullivan was forced to flee the country when her safety could no longer be guaranteed. She spent the rest of her life in exile in Ireland, where she continued to tell the story of the Barracks 7 murders to anyone who would listen. The few other witnesses who had knowledge of the conspiracy were systematically silenced through intimidation, bribery, or elimination. Within 5 years of the murders, almost everyone who could have provided testimony about the crimes was either dead or too frightened to speak. The official records of Ellis Island were carefully edited to remove any reference to the Irish families from the Hibernia or the Barracks 7 fire. Immigration documents were altered or destroyed. Medical records were falsified, and death certificates were eliminated from government archives. By 1900, the mass murder of 41 Irish families had been so successfully erased from official history that most Ellis Island employees had never heard of it, and those who had dismissed it as an urban legend or anti-immigrant propaganda. The buried truth for nearly a century, the Barracks 7 murders remained one of America's most successfully buried secrets. The few historians who stumbled across references to the incident in their research were told that the entire story was a fabrication designed to discredit American immigration policies. The site where Barracks 7 had stood was eventually incorporated into Ellis Island's expanded immigration facilities, with no marker or memorial indicating that it had once been the scene of mass murder. Tourists walked over the ground where 164 Irish immigrants had been burned alive, with no idea of the tragedy that had occurred beneath their feet. The victims themselves were forgotten, their names erased from history, their families in Ireland never learning what had really happened to their relatives who had set out for America with such hope and determination. But secrets this dark have a way of surfacing, especially when they involve crimes committed at the heart of American mythology about immigration and opportunity. The dice of over. Truth about the Barracks 7 murders began to emerge in the 1980s, when renovations of Ellis Island, for its centennial celebration, uncovered physical evidence that had been missed during the original cover-up. During excavation work for the Ellis Island Immigration Museum, construction workers discovered a large deposit of charred wood, melted metal, and human bone fragments buried beneath what had been the foundation of the expanded immigration facility. Initial analysis by the Smithsonian Institution confirmed that the remains were human and dated to the 1890s. More detailed examination revealed evidence of violent death, including bone fragments that showed damage consistent with prolonged exposure to intense heat. The discovery prompted a discreet investigation by the National Park Service, which uncovered additional evidence supporting the basic facts of the IBADORX declassified documents from the investigation, released in the 2000s under the Freedom of Information Act, confirmed that at least 160 people had died in a fire at Ellis Island during the station's first year of operation. But the full extent of government involvement in the murders and the systematic cover-up that followed remains classified to this day. This is where we have to confront the most uncomfortable truth of all. How many other atrocities are hidden beneath America's symbols of hope and opportunity? How many other victims are buried beneath the beautiful stories we tell ourselves about our past? If this story has opened your eyes to the dark secrets that lurked behind official histories, subscribe now and share this video. Because the only way these buried truths survive is if people like you refuse to let them stay buried. The continuing CIO and SPI heresy. Why today? More than 130 years after the Barracks 7 murders, the US government continues to suppress information about the case and resist efforts to provide justice for the victims. Requests for declassification of documents related to the murders are routinely denied on grounds of national security and protection of ongoing investigations. Researchers who attempt to access relevant archives are told that the materials they seek have been lost or destroyed in accordance with standard retention policies. The Ellis Island Immigration Museum, which presents itself as a comprehensive history of American immigration, makes no mention of the Barracks 7 murders or any other systematic violence against immigrants during the station's early years. Most disturbing of all, the site where 164 Irish immigrants were burned alive shows no sign that it was once a mass murder scene. No memorial marks the location where the families died. No historical marker acknowledges the crimes that were committed there. No official recognition has ever been given to the victims or their families. Ellis Island continues to serve as a symbol of American opportunity and compassion, welcoming millions of tourists who come to celebrate their immigrant heritage and learn about the journey to the American dream. They walk over the ground where Irish families were burned alive, pose for photographs where children were murdered, and admire exhibits that celebrate American values, while standing on what was once a crematorium. The ongoing INVSDAJ, despite official efforts to suppress the truth. Independent researchers and activists continued to investigate the Barracks 7 murders and their cover-up. In 2015, a group of Irish-American genealogists using advanced archaeological techniques detected what appeared to be additional unmarked graves in several locations around Ellis Island, including areas that had never been officially acknowledged as burial sites. Their requests to conduct more detailed investigations have been denied by the National Park Service on security and preservation grounds, but the preliminary findings suggest that the Barracks 7 murders may have been just one part of a larger pattern of systematic violence against undesirable immigrants. DNA testing of bone fragments discovered during the 1980s renovations has confirmed that they belonged to at least 40 different individuals, providing scientific evidence that mass deaths did indeed occur at Ellis Island during its early years of operation. Civil rights organizations have filed multiple lawsuits demanding the release of classified documents related to the case and calling for official acknowledgement of the crimes that were committed. These efforts have been consistently blocked by claims of executive privilege and national security exemptions. The moral RACKO Barracks 7 murders force us to confront uncomfortable truths about American immigration history and the gap between our national mythology and historical reality. Ellis Island is remembered as the golden door through which millions of immigrants passed on their way to the American dream. But the evidence suggests that for some immigrants, particularly those from groups deemed undesirable by government officials, Ellis Island was a death trap designed to eliminate them before they could enter American society. The case raises profound questions about the nature of American compassion and the selectivity of our welcome to immigrants. At what point does immigration control become ethnic cleansing? When does public health policy become genocide? Perhaps most troubling of all, the Barracks 7 murders reveal how easily governments can erase inconvenient truths from the historical record when those truths threaten established narratives about national virtue and moral progress. The 41 Irish families who died in the fire were not criminals or enemies of America. They were ordinary people seeking better lives for themselves and their children. They deserve the opportunity to pursue the American dream, not death in a government-sponsored crematorium. Their murders and the subsequent cover-up represent a betrayal of the very principles that Ellis Island was supposed to represent. The station that proclaimed itself a beacon of hope and opportunity was also a place where immigrants could be murdered with impunity if they were deemed unworthy of American citizenship. The legacy of Syrians, the most damning aspect of the Barracks 7 murders, is not the original crime, but the continuing conspiracy to hide it from the American people. For over 130 years, the U.S. government has maintained an elaborate cover-up that has denied justice to the victims, deceived the public about the true nature of Ellis Island's history, and corrupted our understanding of American immigration. Every president since Benjamin Harrison has had the opportunity to acknowledge these crimes and provide some measure of justice to the victims and their families. Every president has chosen to maintain the cover-up instead. Every tour guide who leads visitors through Ellis Island, without mentioning its bloody history, is participating in the ongoing deception. Every museum exhibit that presents Ellis Island as a purely positive symbol, without acknowledging its capacity for violence, is contributing to the conspiracy of silence. The Barracks 7 murders remind us that even our most cherished symbols and institutions can hide dark secrets. They force us to question official narratives and demand transparency from our government, even when that transparency reveals uncomfortable truths about our past. Most importantly, they demonstrate that crimes committed by the powerful will remain hidden only as long as ordinary citizens allow them to remain hidden. The truth emerges only when people are willing to ask difficult questions, challenge official stories, and refuse to accept easy lies. The call for JUSD, the descendants of the 41 Irish families who died in the Barracks 7 fire, have never received justice for their ancestors' deaths, or even official acknowledgement that the murders occurred. Working with genealogical records and DNA evidence, researchers have identified dozens of living descendants of the victims scattered across America and Ireland. These families have been kept in the dark about their ancestors' fate for over a century. told only that their relatives had disappeared after arriving in America. Mary O'Brien Walsh, the great-great-granddaughter of Patrick and Mary O'Brien, learned about her family's true fate only in 2018 when researchers contacted her with evidence of the Barracks 7 murders. "My family always wondered what happened to our relatives who came to America in 1892, she says. "We were told they had probably died of disease or accident. Never that they were murdered by the government they trusted to protect them." The Barracks 7 Memorial Foundation, established by descendants of the victims, has been working to force government acknowledgement of the murders and secure proper burial for any remains that can be recovered. "These families came to America seeking freedom and opportunity," says Foundation President Sean Murphy, whose great-grandfather died in the fire. "Instead, they found death and unmarked graves. The least we can do is tell their story and give them the dignity in death that they were denied in life. The choice is ours. We can continue to accept the sanitized version of immigration history that powerful institutions want us to believe. Or we can demand the truth about what really happened at Ellis Island during those dark early days. We can honor the 41 families by acknowledging their murders and demanding justice, or we can allow their killers to be remembered as heroes while their own names are forgotten." The truth about Ellis Island's bloody secret challenges everything we want to believe about American compassion and opportunity. It forces us to confront the reality that our most sacred symbols can hide our most shameful crimes. But it also demonstrates the power of ordinary people to uncover buried truths and demand justice, even when the crimes were committed by the most powerful institutions in society. The 41 Irish families who died in Barracks 7 are still waiting for justice. Their voices are still calling to us from beneath the tourist attractions and museum exhibits, still demanding that their story be told, their deaths be acknowledged, their killers be held accountable. The question is, are we finally ready to listen? The flames that consumed those families in 1892 cast shadows that still darken Ellis Island today. Until we confront the truth about what happened in Barracks 7, until we acknowledge the victims and expose the conspiracy that killed them, those shadows will continue to haunt America's most celebrated symbol of hope and opportunity. The choice is ours. The silence can continue, or it can end here. With you, with this moment, with your decision to refuse to let these voices be silenced forever. What will you choose?